Welcome back. Today we are investigating one of the largest transformations in modern history. How did a continent filled with native nations become a collection of European colonies, then a fragile republic, then an industrial giant, and finally one of the most powerful countries in the world? The usual story begins with empty land. It begins with forests, open plains, and a few scattered tribes waiting for history to arrive from Europe. But that story is wrong. Long before the United States existed, North America was already home to hundreds of distinct peoples. They spoke different languages. They built towns, farms, roads, trade networks, alliances, and political confederacies. They fought wars, negotiated peace, moved across the land, and shaped the environment around them. The continent was not empty. It was not waiting to be discovered. It already had history. Then new ships appeared on the Atlantic coast. European empires began to claim land they did not understand. Disease destroyed communities before many people ever saw a European face. Trade created new alliances. Weapons changed the balance of power. Settlements became colonies. Colonies became a rebellion. The rebellion became a nation, and that nation expanded across the continent with extraordinary speed. But the rise of the United States was never a simple march toward freedom. It was built through ideals and contradictions. Liberty existed beside slavery. Democracy expanded while native nations were forced from their lands. Industry created enormous wealth, while workers endured dangerous conditions. Immigrants built cities and railroads while facing exclusion and violence. The country opposed European empires, then created overseas possessions of its own. It entered 2 world wars reluctantly, then emerged from the second at the center of a new global order. So how did this happen? Was American power created by democracy, by geography, by war, by immigration, by natural resources, by slavery and territorial conquest, by industrial capitalism, or by a combination of all of them? To answer that, we need to begin before there was an America. Before 1492, the peoples of North America lived in many different worlds. In the Southwest, Pueblo communities built multi-story settlements from stone and earth. Across the Mississippi Valley, complex agricultural societies had created large towns and ceremonial centers. Cahokia, near the modern city of St. Louis, once contained massive earthworks and supported a population larger than many European towns of its time. In the Northeast, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy united several nations through a sophisticated political alliance. Along the Atlantic coast, communities farmed corn, beans, and squash, fished rivers, hunted forests, and traded across long distances. On the Great Plains, societies adapted to grasslands that would later be transformed by the arrival of horses. Along the Pacific coast, rich fisheries supported permanent communities with complex social traditions. There was no single native culture. There was no single native government. There were hundreds of nations with their own identities, rivalries, beliefs, and strategies. When Europeans arrived, they entered this already crowded political world. Spanish colonizers moved north from the Caribbean and Mexico. French traders established networks through Canada and the Mississippi Valley. Dutch merchants built settlements around the Hudson River. English colonists created Jamestown in 1607 and Plymouth in 1620. None of these colonies survived through European effort alone. Settlers depended on native food, knowledge, trade, diplomacy, and geography. Some native nations formed alliances with newcomers to strengthen their position against old rivals. Others resisted settlement from the beginning. Many attempted both cooperation and resistance at different times. But one force changed the continent before armies or treaties could fully decide its future: disease. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other infections crossed the Atlantic with Europeans and Africans. Native populations had no previous exposure to many of these diseases. Entire communities collapsed. Political systems weakened. Fields were abandoned. Survivors were absorbed into neighboring nations or forced to relocate. European colonization did not advance only because of superior weapons. It advanced through a biological catastrophe. The colonies also developed through labor. At first, European powers experimented with native enslavement, indentured servants, prisoners, and poor migrants. but plantation economies increasingly depended on enslaved Africans. In the Chesapeake, tobacco generated wealth. In the Caribbean and the southern mainland colonies, sugar, rice, indigo, and later cotton tied American land to Atlantic slavery. Millions of Africans were forced across the ocean. Their labor helped create the wealth that made colonial expansion possible. Their cultures, languages, skills, and resistance also reshaped America. By the 18th century, Britain controlled 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast. These colonies were not one united society. New England towns differed from southern plantations. Merchants in Boston had different interests from frontier farmers or enslaved workers in Virginia. But British wars changed their relationship with the empire. After victory over France in the 7 Years' War, Britain tried to raise revenue and tighten control. Colonists protested taxes, trade rules, and the presence of British troops. They argued that Parliament was violating their rights. Tension became violence. Fighting began at Lexington and Concord in 1775. In 1776, colonial leaders declared independence. The Declaration of Independence announced that people possessed natural rights and that governments gained authority from the consent of the governed. These were revolutionary ideas. They would inspire movements far beyond North America, but the Declaration was also limited by the society that produced it. Many of its signers owned enslaved people. Women lacked political rights. Native nations were treated as obstacles or enemies. The new republic was born speaking the language of universal liberty while excluding much of the population from that promise. The American Revolution succeeded because colonial forces survived long enough to gain international support. France entered the war against Britain. Spanish pressure also weakened British power. At Yorktown in 1781, British forces surrendered. The Treaty of Paris recognized the independence of the United States, but independence did not guarantee survival. The first national government was weak. The states competed with one another. Debt remained high. Foreign powers controlled important frontiers. The Constitution of 1787 created a stronger federal government. It divided power among Congress, the President, and the courts. It created mechanisms for taxation, national defense, and interstate commerce. The Bill of Rights later protected specific liberties. These institutions gave the new country greater stability than many revolutionary governments achieved. But the Constitution also protected slavery through compromises. Political unity was purchased by postponing the most dangerous conflict in the nation. Then the United States began to expand. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase doubled the country's claimed territory. Explorers mapped routes west. Settlers followed rivers, trails, and military roads. Land became the foundation of American growth. It provided farms, timber, minerals, and speculation. But the land was not unoccupied. It belonged to native nations. American expansion therefore required treaties, pressure, warfare, and removal. Some treaties were negotiated under unequal conditions. Others were broken. Native communities adapted, traded, resisted, sued in American courts, and attempted to preserve their sovereignty. Yet the federal government increasingly treated removal as policy. Under President Andrew Jackson, the Indian Removal Act of 1830 opened the way for the forced relocation of native nations from the Southeast. The Cherokee, Muskogee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole peoples faced expulsion. The forced Cherokee journey west became known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands died through disease, hunger, exposure, and exhaustion. This was not an accidental side effect of American expansion. Removal made land available for white settlement and plantation slavery. Cotton transformed the Southern economy. The invention of the cotton gin increased the profitability of processing cotton. Plantations spread into new territories. The domestic slave trade forced hundreds of thousands of enslaved people south and west. Families were separated. Human beings were sold to support a growing international industry. At the same time, the northern states were developing factories, canals, banks, and commercial cities. The Erie Canal connected the Atlantic coast to inland markets. Railroads began to reduce distance. The United States was becoming a continental economy. The idea of manifest destiny gave expansion a moral language. Supporters claimed that the United States was destined to spread across North America. Texas broke from Mexico and was later annexed by the United States. War with Mexico began in 1846. American victory brought an enormous transfer of territory, including lands that became California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of other states. The discovery of gold in California accelerated migration to the Pacific. Within decades, the United States stretched from one ocean to the other. This continental position became one of the foundations of its later power. The country possessed vast farmland, forests, coal, oil, iron, rivers, ports, and access to both the Atlantic and Pacific. But expansion intensified the question the founders had postponed. Would slavery expand into the new territories? The issue divided political parties, churches, communities, and families. Abolitionists demanded the end of slavery. Enslaved people resisted through escape, rebellion, work slowdowns, family networks, and later military service. Southern leaders defended slavery as central to their economy and social order. After Abraham Lincoln won the presidential election of 1860, Southern states began to secede. They formed the Confederacy. The Civil War began in 1861. At first, the Union fought mainly to preserve the country, but slavery was impossible to separate from the conflict. The Emancipation Proclamation transformed the war by declaring enslaved people free in areas under rebellion. Nearly 200,000 black men served in Union forces. The war became a struggle over the future of slavery and the meaning of citizenship. The Union possessed major advantages: a larger population, more industry, more railroads, a stronger navy, greater financial capacity. But victory required 4 years of enormous violence. The Civil War killed more Americans than any other war in the nation's history. Cities and farms across the South were destroyed. In 1865, the Confederacy collapsed. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment defined national citizenship and equal protection. The 15th Amendment prohibited denying the vote on the basis of race. For a brief period during Reconstruction, Black Americans voted, held public office, built schools, and participated in new state governments. More than 1,500 Black officials served in Southern legislatures, courthouses, and Congress within a decade of emancipation. But white supremacist violence and political compromise undermined these gains. Armed militias attacked Black voters and office holders. Federal troops withdrew from the South in 1877 as part of a political bargain. Federal protection weakened. Southern states created systems of segregation and disenfranchisement, later known as Jim Crow. Slavery had ended. Racial hierarchy survived in new forms. After the Civil War, the country entered an age of industrial acceleration. Railroads connected distant regions into one national market. The first transcontinental railroad was completed in 1869. Steel production expanded. Oil refining created vast fortunes. Electricity changed factories and cities. Corporations became larger than any earlier American business. Industrialists such as Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan accumulated extraordinary power. The United States possessed the resources, labor, capital, and market needed for rapid growth. Immigration supplied millions of workers. People arrived from Ireland, Germany, Italy, Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, China, and many other regions. They built railroads, worked in mines, entered factories, opened shops, and filled expanding cities. Between 1870 and 1900, nearly 12 million immigrants entered the United States. But opportunity came with exploitation. Factory work was dangerous. Housing was overcrowded. Children worked long hours. Labor unions fought for wages, safety, and shorter working days. Strikes were sometimes met with police, private guards, or federal troops. Chinese workers helped build the Western railroads, then faced violent racism and the Chinese Exclusion Act. American growth depended on immigration, while repeatedly defining certain immigrants as threats. Industrial expansion also transformed the West. Railroads carried settlers, cattle, soldiers, and goods across the plains. Bison herds were nearly destroyed. Native nations lost the ecological base that had supported many communities. The U.S. Army fought a series of wars against indigenous resistance. Reservations restricted movement. Federal boarding schools attempted to remove native languages, cultures, and family ties. The goal was not only to take land. It was to force native peoples into an American system designed by others. Yet native nations survived. They preserved identity, rebuilt institutions, defended treaty rights, and continued as political communities. By the end of the 19th century, the United States had become an industrial giant. Its factories produced steel, machinery, weapons, and consumer goods. Its rail network tied the continent together. Its population was growing rapidly. Its businesses sought markets beyond North America. Then came 1898. The United States went to war with Spain over the crisis in Cuba. The war was short. Its consequences were enormous. Spain gave up Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The United States annexed Hawaii during the conflict. American power now extended into the Caribbean and Pacific. The republic that had once rebelled against empire had become an overseas imperial power. The Philippine-American War followed as Filipinos resisted American rule. The conflict exposed another contradiction. The United States claimed to spread freedom while denying independence to people under its own control. At the beginning of the 20th century, American leaders built a larger navy, expanded overseas bases, and increased influence in Latin America and Asia. The Panama Canal connected the Atlantic and Pacific more efficiently. American companies and banks expanded abroad. The United States was no longer simply a continental nation. It had become a world power. World War I accelerated that change. The United States remained neutral at first. It sold goods and lent money to Allied powers. In 1917, unrestricted German submarine warfare and other pressures brought the country into the conflict. American troops and resources helped strengthen the Allies. The war ended before the United States suffered destruction on the scale experienced by Europe. American financial influence increased. Yet after the war, the country rejected membership in the League of Nations and turned inward politically. The 1920s brought mass production, automobiles, radios, advertising, and consumer credit. American culture spread through film, music, and business. But prosperity was uneven. Farmers struggled. Workers remained vulnerable. Speculation increased. In 1929, the stock market crashed. The Great Depression destroyed banks, businesses, jobs, and savings. Unemployment reached catastrophic levels. The crisis threatened confidence in capitalism and government itself. President Franklin D. Roosevelt responded with the New Deal. Federal programs created jobs, regulated finance, supported agriculture, and established social protections. The New Deal did not end every hardship, but it expanded the role of the federal government and created institutions that helped stabilize American society. Then World War II transformed the nation more deeply than any economic program could. After Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States entered the war. Factories shifted to military production. Automobile plants built aircraft and tanks. Shipyards launched vessels at extraordinary speed. Women entered industrial jobs in large numbers. Black Americans moved to defense centers and demanded greater rights. The federal government coordinated science, labor, finance, and industry on a massive scale. The United States fought in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. Its territory, apart from Hawaii and a few scattered attacks, did not suffer the widespread destruction seen across Europe and Asia. That single fact would shape the next 80 years of world history. By 1945, many old industrial powers were exhausted or devastated. American factories were intact. American production had expanded. The United States possessed an enormous military. It also possessed the atomic bomb. This was the decisive turning point. The United States emerged from World War II as one of the central economic, political, and military powers on Earth. It helped create the United Nations. It supported institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. The dollar became central to the international financial system. The Marshall Plan sent aid to rebuild Western Europe while strengthening American influence. Military alliances, especially NATO, placed the United States at the center of a global security network. But another superpower had also emerged: the Soviet Union. The Cold War divided the world into competing blocs. The United States built military bases across the globe. It fought in Korea and Vietnam. It supported friendly governments, including authoritarian regimes, when leaders believed this would contain communism. In Iran, Guatemala, and Chile, the CIA helped engineer the removal of elected leaders it judged too close to the Soviet orbit. Nuclear weapons created the possibility of global destruction. American power defended allies and helped build international systems. It also produced intervention, war, and backlash. Inside the United States, another struggle challenged the country's claim to represent freedom. Black Americans fought segregation through courts, boycotts, marches, organizing, and direct action. The Montgomery bus boycott, the Greensboro sit-ins, and the March on Washington built pressure the federal government could no longer ignore. The civil rights movement forced the federal government to confront laws that denied equal citizenship. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965 marked major victories. But racial inequality did not disappear. Native activists demanded sovereignty and treaty rights. Women challenged legal and social discrimination. Latino workers organized for labor rights. Anti-war movements questioned American intervention abroad. The country's power grew alongside internal conflict over who was allowed to share in it. The space race became another symbol of competition. In 1969, American astronauts landed on the moon. The achievement combined military research, federal funding, universities, private industry, and national ambition. It showed how the United States could mobilize enormous resources around science and technology. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the United States entered a period with no equal global rival. Its military reach was unmatched. Its technology companies shaped the digital world. Wall Street influenced global finance. Hollywood, television, music, universities, and consumer brands spread American culture. The Internet grew through research supported by the American government and transformed by private enterprise. Immigration continued to bring talent, labor, ideas, and cultural change. Yet power also created new vulnerabilities. The attacks of September 11, 2001, led to wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The financial crisis of 2008 exposed instability inside the economic system. Industrial jobs moved abroad or disappeared through automation. Political polarization deepened. China's rise challenged American economic and strategic dominance. Climate change, inequality, debt, and distrust placed pressure on institutions. The United States remained extraordinarily powerful, but it was not invulnerable. So how did America become a global superpower? There was no single secret. Geography mattered. The United States gained control of a continent rich in farmland, minerals, rivers, and coastlines. Resources mattered. Coal, oil, iron, timber, and food supported industrial growth. Immigration mattered. People from around the world supplied labor, knowledge, entrepreneurship, and scientific talent. Institutions mattered. The Constitution created a government capable of surviving crises, collecting revenue, regulating commerce, and expanding federal power. Capitalism mattered. Investment, competition, corporations, and mass markets drove innovation and production. War mattered. The Civil War strengthened the federal state. The Spanish-American War created overseas power. The World Wars weakened older empires while expanding American industry and finance. But conquest also mattered. The United States expanded through native dispossession and war with Mexico. Slavery mattered. Enslaved labor generated enormous wealth and fed national and international markets. Exclusion mattered. Native peoples, Black Americans, women, immigrants, and workers repeatedly paid the price of growth while being denied equal power. American history is not a simple story of good institutions producing success. It is the story of a nation that built power by combining democratic ideals, continental resources, mass migration, industrial technology, territorial expansion, forced labor, military strength, and repeated reinvention. The country became powerful because it could absorb people and resources on an extraordinary scale. It became powerful because its industries survived 2 world wars that devastated competitors. It became powerful because after 1945, it helped design a global system in which American finance, military alliances, technology, and culture held central positions. But the deeper question remains: what was the price? For Native nations, the price included land, lives, sovereignty, and generations of forced assimilation. For enslaved Africans and their descendants, the price included centuries of bondage, segregation, and exclusion. For workers, the price included dangerous labor and violent struggles for basic protections. For people abroad, American power sometimes meant reconstruction and security. At other times, it meant occupation, intervention, or war. The United States became one of the strongest countries in history not because it escaped contradiction, but because it repeatedly grew through contradiction. It declared liberty while practicing slavery. It resisted empire, then built one. It welcomed immigrants, then excluded them. It promoted democracy, then sometimes supported dictators. It created immense wealth while allowing deep inequality. And yet, the people excluded from the promise of America repeatedly used that promise to demand change. That may be the most important force in the story. The Declaration's language did not describe reality in 1776, but generations of Americans used it as a weapon against the reality they inherited. Enslaved people demanded freedom. Women demanded citizenship. Workers demanded dignity. Immigrants demanded belonging. Native nations demanded sovereignty. Civil rights activists demanded that the country obey its own ideals. America's rise was not created only by presidents, generals, or billionaires. It was also created by millions of people who worked, migrated, resisted, invented, fought, protested, and rebuilt. The land was never empty. The nation was never simple, and its power was never inevitable. The United States became a global superpower through opportunity and violence, freedom and exclusion, innovation and exploitation, geography and war. That is the real history, not the story of a wilderness becoming civilized, but the story of many peoples, many struggles, and a nation that grew powerful while still fighting over what its power was supposed to mean.